So you're all very, very welcome, and it's fantastic to see so many people from so many diverse disciplines here. Very much a testimony, I think, to the kinds of work that that Terence Cave does, and also that the Balzan project did from its inception in 2010. It's a real pleasure to introduce you all, to welcome you all here to Torch today. Torch being our interdisciplinary research centre in the humanities that reaches across the disciplines in the humanities and more widely, as with the cognitive work that Terence Cave, amongst others, has been part of. It's also a great personal pleasure for me because I was one of the several people in this room who were involved in the Balzan project over the years, involved in the different discussions and the insightful and fascinating talk shops and conferences and workshops that we had. So there's great pleasure today in welcoming this panel. I'm not chairing the panel, however. That work is Emily Troscienko's job. She was another person who was centrally involved in the Balzan project. So I'm now going to hand over to Emily to introduce the panel and the book.
Thank you very much, Elika, and welcome everyone. So the idea behind this Book at Lunchtime series of Torches is to bring together the authors of new interdisciplinary books with commentators from a range of relevant backgrounds, with also you, the audience, for some short and sweet discussion. So the format today will be, after just a few more minutes from me, then we'll hear for around 7 minutes from our three commentators. Then Terence will have about the same length of time to respond to them, and after that I'll open the floor to you for any questions, comments or ideas you might like to share. And we'll bring things to a close just before 2 o'clock. I first met Terence in 2010. I just arrived at St John's as a junior research fellow, and Terence's professorship in French was continuing, but had just taken a slightly new tack. The year before, he'd found out that he'd been awarded the prestigious Balzan Foundation Prize for Literature since 1500, and he'd had, I think, 6 weeks to work out what he wanted to do with this pretty much no-strings-attached cash windfall. And he'd come up with the project, which went by the formal title, Literature as an Object of Knowledge, and gradually acquired the informal title, which is also the title of his book, Thinking with Literature. In all the now 5.5 years since I've known Terence, I've been really excited to see what this book would be like, and it is not a disappointment. It is a wonderful read, and I think an important book. So, as I say, I've only known Terence in what I think of as his cognitive phase, but I gather that he had quite an illustrious literary critical career before that. It would be easy, however, to see that illustrious pre-career as already showing lots of signs of becoming very cognitive. If you look at his important 1988 book, Recognitions, A Study in Poetics, for example, it's all about why recognition scenes in literature aren't just boring trite plot contrivances, but actually have the capacity to entertain, to surprise, to disturb readers, right from ancient Greek readers to today. So you could see that as already starting to tackle interesting cognitive questions. Even the earlier cornucopian text, Problems of Writing in the French Renaissance, published in 1979, deals with things, again, that you could think of as quintessentially cognitive, like interpretation and improvisation. And certainly once you get to Terence's 2007 book, How to Read Montaigne, the importance of cognition in both the writerly and the readerly context has very much taken centre stage. Montaigne's work, Terence suggests, can be thought of as providing us with a mapping of a mental landscape. But in a way, this isn't what I want to be arguing at all about Terence's career trajectory, because for me, I think the most wonderful thing about this phase of Terence's career that I know about most closely is how new and adventurous and open-minded it is. There are, of course, these cognitive continuities, but there has also been a decisive shift in both focus and methods. It's been really quite humbling to watch someone who has had such a successful career in what I think of as more like the mainstream of literary studies, seize this opportunity not to do more of the same, but instead to gather around him a very carefully collected group of of interested people from across the humanities and the cognitive sciences, and allow them to talk with each other, to argue with each other, to be encouraged to change our minds even occasionally. And it's been such a privilege for me to be part of those conversations and to be part of the one that we're going to have here today. So in order to make it slightly more a conversation and less me just chatting to myself, I will now briefly introduce our three commentators for today. The linguist Deirdre Wilson, the psychologist Ilona Roth, and the writer and critic Dame Marina Warner. So we'll proceed in the order that I've just outlined. So we'll start with Deirdre, who is Emeritus Professor of Linguistics at University College London and Research Professor at the Centre for the Study of the Mind in Nature at the University of Oslo. Together with the anthropologist Dan Sperber, she developed the theory of communication known as Relevance Theory, which has been highly influential, not least, I think, on Terence thinking. Ilona is Senior Lecturer in Psychology at the Open University. She's carried out important research on the imagination, particularly in connection with autism and more recently dementia. Her 2007 book, edited book, Imaginative Minds, was one of the ones that Terence referred to in the first piece of writing of his that I ever read, which was an early attempt to work out what a cognitive criticism might look like. And Marina Warner is a writer of fiction and non-fiction and an associate member of the English faculty here, as well as a fellow of the British Academy, and recipient of numerous prizes for fiction and literary criticism. Her novel, The Lost Father, was shortlisted for the Booker Prize in 1988, and last year she chaired the Man Booker International Prize judging panel. So it's a great pleasure to have you all here today. Thank you for agreeing to speak. Deirdre, would you like to come up here and kick things off?
First, I'd like to echo everything that Emily has said about Terence's book. I think it's a wonderful book. It's just been a huge pleasure to read, and I've learned a huge amount from it. As Emily says, most of my work has been on communication and on linguistic communication in particular. And what's impressed me most about the book is its attempt to see how literary criticism might evolve in the light of recent theories of communication and cognition. And the aim is not to use these recent theories to solve traditional problems of literary criticism, but to produce what Terence calls a cognitively inflected criticism, which means that it's a criticism that isn't marred or isn't flawed by outdated theories of language, of communication, and of cognition. And here I think he succeeds brilliantly. It really is a wonderful book. At the same time, I think it presents and is meant to present a challenge to the sort of theory of communication, relevance theory, that Dan Sperber and I have been working on for the last many years, by showing with its beautiful examples of close reading how complex, how nuanced, how precise, and yet how unparaphrasable the communicative effects of literary works are. And so the challenge is, can any theory of communication deal with those very complex, nuanced effects which Terence illustrates so well throughout his book? Now, Terence is extremely generous about relevance theory, but I detect lurking in the undergrowth a certain amount of skepticism about how far relevance theory can take us. He has a sneaking feeling that it's still not up to the job. And I've put on the handout a couple of quotes from the book, which I chose, for their controversial nature, because I want to defend the theory. So I put them, because I'll rattle through them very fast. The first one is, a theory of language according to which the communication of propositional content has priority is likely to run into difficulty with literary critics who may want to argue that poetry, literary style, perhaps also whole prose fictions, are modes of communication in which propositional content is only one factor, and indeed, at least in some cases, a subordinate one. If Donne's A Valediction Forbidding Mourning, or Shakespeare's The Tempest is paraphrased, or even translated, translation being a specially confined mode of paraphrase, most people will agree that much of what made the work distinctive will be lost. And it doesn't seem satisfactory to argue that what is lost is only packaging, a residual formal apparatus that is not part of the message, or that is only the affective and kinesic dimensions of the literary utterance. The hackles of literary readers and critics would instantly rise at the very word only in these last propositions. The manner of delivery is of the essence in the experience mediated by literary communication. That's why poetry, in the broadest sense of the word, has for 3 millennia been an exemplary point of reference in the classical tradition of rhetoric, which is itself a theory of communication. So reading this after reading all Terence's nice words about relevance theory, I thought, well, surely he can't mean me. But going on a few pages, you find a second quote on your handout, which makes it very clear it is relevance theory you've got in mind. So it says, despite everything that relevance theorists say about weak implicatures, metaphor, poetic effects and the like, it seems to me that the standard model they adopt remains that of a practical message where the propositional content can easily be verified and where the utterance itself can be translated into any language without significant loss of meaning. Now, I just want to make 3 brief responses to those quotes, which I don't think are representative, actually, of Terence's general views on relevance theory. But they raise a lot of points that standard literary criticism would raise, and actually many people within relevance theory have made very similar points. So this is not a critique of Terence, it's a wondering about whether he's right. So 3 quick points then. First, relevance theory is not a theory of language. It's not even a theory of linguistic communication alone. It's a theory of a certain type of human communication, both verbal and non-verbal. It explicitly set out to deal with a much broader range of communicative acts than most linguists or philosophers take into account. And it argues against those like the philosopher Donald Davidson or recently Ernie Lepore and Matthew Stone, who do believe that what is communicated must be paraphrasable as a proposition or a small set of propositions, and who indeed explicitly deny that metaphor communicates anything at all, precisely because it can't. Metaphor communicates so much more than just something that can be paraphrased as a simple message. Relevance theory is not just a theory of language. It aims to deal with the full range of communicative acts, both verbal and non-verbal. For instance, ringing a doorbell, showing a photograph, mimicking a politician, drawing a caricature, making a face, writing a poem, and explicitly rejects these narrower views of communication. Of course, it may not be right to do it, and that's the real issue. Second, then, by rejecting the code model of communication, as relevance theory does, and denying that whatever is communicated must be encoded by a grammar, by a set of rules, relevance theory allows us to take into account not just the encoded content of an act of communication, but the manner in which it's produced. In the case of ringing a doorbell, how long it was rung, how impatiently, how angrily, how all that is part of the manner of performance, and it affects the interpretation. In the case of mimicry, what's the attitude of the mimicker? Is it mocking, tender, bitter, savage? All those things are part of the manner of performance. They affect how the act of communication is understood. And in the case of a poem, precisely those subtle clues that create the nuances that Terence is so good at bringing to our attention in his examples of close reading. Any sensory aspect of an act of communication that the audience can perceive can create such nuances. And by insisting that what is communicated does not have to be a standard message that can be paraphrased, as relevance theory does, it has a chance of coming to grips, I think, with literary communication. And third, then very briefly, for relevance theory, the act of communication is a matter of drawing inferences about the communicator's intentions, about the manner in which the communicative act is performed and so on. But Terence is rather skeptical about how far inference can take us. And again, I've put a few quotes on the handout. He sees inference as a rather dry formal matter, a matter of abstract reasoning or logic. He talks of abstract logical procedures, rigorously inferential procedures, abstract inferential loops, and so on. But it's important here to notice that relevance theorists have increasingly been broadening the notion of inference that they use and arguing that it's a much broader notion than either logic or reasoning. I've just been reading the manuscript of a book by Dan Sperber and Hugo Mercier called The Enigma of Human Reasoning, which does this wonderful analysis of the differences precisely between logic, reasoning, and inference. Inference is the broadest possible thing. Ants perform inference, babies perform inference. It's any procedure that will take you from a perception, from a memory, from an utterance, to a warranted conclusion. And there's millions and millions of procedures that do that. So my conclusion then is that I think with a broad enough notion of communication itself, a broad enough idea about the sort of thing can be communicated, and a broad enough idea of inference, we have a theory that can at least start to come to grips with the wonderful work that Terence and other literary critics have produced in explaining, what a complex thing literary communication is. Thank you.
I'm going to start with a quote. There are people who are aghast at the simple attempt to reconcile science and art, and who protest at the mere thought of introducing science into the domain of art. Now, this is just one of many comments on the question of the two cultures, and such is not particularly important here, but it's significant in the present context because the author is Paul Richer, who was the artist collaborator of Charcot, the 19th century founding father of French neurology. Terence Cave's new book, Thinking with Literature, is in my view a shining example of how to bring together the cognitive and neurosciences with literary studies. From the standpoint of a psychologist, which I am, interested in literature, both professionally and personally, it seems almost self-evident that cognitive science offers a framework relevant to literary studies. So the resistance that Terence mentions in the book's opening pages seems hard to comprehend. But then I recall that among my own colleagues, predominantly neuroscientists, geneticists, and so on, there are few who understand why I consider literature relevant for my own research, so it cuts both ways. I've thoroughly enjoyed this book, which is written with just the kind of lightness and colour that Terence so aptly relates to imagination in his chapter, The Balloon of the Mind. I especially enjoyed the exercises in close reading from a cognitive perspective. The analysis of Winnie the Pooh's adventure with balloons and bees in Chapter 3 is a tour de force, bringing into focus many of the key cognitive constructs discussed in the volume, notably inference, counterfactual reasoning, affordance, pretense, ad hoc concepts, theory of mind, kinesis, and belief in the story world. I'd like now to highlight a few aspects of the approach taken in this book, which I believe are relevant for the wider rapprochement between the cognitive sciences and the humanities. Let me start with a concern that Terence expresses in Chapter 2. In talking of the tempting array of recent findings in cognitive science and neuroscience, which seem ripe for transference to literary studies, he states that a less technical mode of transfer risks becoming a kind of pirate raid, in which one grabs some interesting sounding ideas and carries them off for consumption on home territory. Well, I have no real problems with the pirate raid. Why shouldn't a researcher, especially one of Terence's erudition and flair, recruit those ideas and imply them in those ways which seem most promising for literary studies? But there are some consequences which may merit further consideration. Firstly, selectivity. It seems to me that certain cognitive theories and constructs have a particular affinity and fit with literature and literary studies, perhaps themselves acting little like affordances, while for other theories that are of importance in cognition, the fit is perhaps less obvious and less intuitively pleasing. A case in point of a cognate theory is theory of mind, the notion that a quintessentially human activity is attributing thoughts, intentions and feelings to others, and to oneself, of course. This idea of mind reading has a clear value in understanding how the reader engages with a novel or attributes meaning to a line of poetry. And it's fitting that this book and other work in the humanities gives it so much attention. Certain other cognitive constructs have had much less impact. An example here would be executive function, the cognitive process of organising thought and action to meet goals, take decisions, and switch from one task to another. I may be wrong, but this phenomenon seems not to have caught the imagination of literary theorists, yet it is closely associated with cognitive flexibility and plays a role in cognitive creativity tests. Also, like theory of mind, there is evidence that executive function is impaired in many people on the autism spectrum. My second point about the broader features of this approach is about adaptation. Certain key cognitive constructs in this book have been applied in a wider and richer sense than in the original. And one such adaptation which caused me to reflect was that of affordance. The original concept derives from James Gibson, who sought to explain the effortless, almost instantaneous linking of perceptual stimuli to appropriate responses on the part of the organism. So the accuracy and speed with which, say, a seagull dives and catches a piece of fish seemed inexplicable by the kind of inferential hypothesis testing model of perception proposed by Richard Gregory at around the same time. Gibson described affordance as a finely tuned complementarity between environmental stimuli and the animal's perceptuomotor system, which imposes constraints on the range of perceptual interpretations, though Gibson would never have used that word. The possible responses are afforded, or even one might say specified, in a way that a hypothesis-driven approach would simply fail to achieve in the time available. Terence extends the notion of affordance to human cultural artefacts, broadening the term to include not only the uses of such artefacts, but the artefacts themselves, and not only obvious tools, such as paper, pen, books, and so on, but also concepts and language. An interesting aspect of this much broader usage is the notion that complex cognitive affordances are inherently underspecified. They rely on the supremely inferential capacities of the human mind to supply just that interpretation which is relevant. I wonder whether this represents a significant departure from Gibson's model, in which, as I understand it, placed affordance in opposition to inference. And I note Terence' claim in Chapter 6 that metaphors achieve their impact through sensory-motor affordance rather than the inferences implied by relevance theory. And also in Chapter 7, where he talks of imagination not as representation of a chain of embedded intentionality, but as a single shared moment of action and intention. This is, I think, very much in the spirit of Gibson. Whether it's in the spirit of inference, I'm not so sure. I think it's very interesting that Deirdre raised that point about relevance theory widening the notion of inference. My final point is about empirical verification, or should I say testability. There are some strong claims in this book about how literature, and especially poetry, achieves its impact on the human mind. For instance, in several places, Terence makes a case for the kinesic effects, the idea that the imagery of a poem evokes shadow sensory-motor responses in the listener. This is a very persuasive idea, especially when we're presented with poems such as this. Hands, do what you're bid. Bring the balloon of the mind that bellies and drags in the wind into its narrow shed. But are such kinesic effects instantiated in brain activity? And if so, do they occur for everyone? Or are there perhaps differences in the way literary devices impact on individual minds? With the range of brain scanning techniques available these days, it seems to me that questions such as these can and should be put to empirical test. A recent study by Adam Zeman and colleagues in 2013 used fMRI to compare the brain regions which are active when participants read poetry or prose. There were certainly differences in the regions activated. For instance, the poetry activated more right hemispheric regions. And more interestingly, poetry and prose, rated as strongly emotional, these samples differed in how emotional they were rated, activated brain regions also associated with the shivers down the spine effects of certain kinds of music. And so these regions included cerebellum, thalamus, and the premotor cortex, all of which are associated with movement, as well as the cingulate and other regions associated with emotion. Such a paradigm, I think, could be readily adapted to explore the kinesic impact of different types of poetry. To conclude, it has been a privilege to offer a few reflections here, albeit ones which merely skim the surface of this useful and profoundly thought-provoking volume. Thank you.
It's a manifesto for literature that is both written literature and spoken, recited, performed exchanges of stories. And one of the characteristics of the range of examples that Terence draws on is that he's not in the least bit judgmental. It's a very broad ecology of literature that he's interested in, going all the way from Mallarmé and Surrealists to Scandi Noir. And every example is wonderfully chosen, wonderfully apposite. And the book is actually very difficult for someone like me who's not used to the language of psychology or the language of philosophy or linguistics. It is actually quite a hard book at times to read, but it is leavened by this wit and actual charm too, as you heard from Ilona in the case of the Pooh Bear episodes. It is above all a truly important argument for the importance of the humanities to the general fabric of intellectual, emotional, and social life. And it couldn't come at a better moment and needs to be paid attention to for many, many reasons. And I too am going to read a quotation from the book. Human cognition is alert, attentive, responsive. Above all, it is imaginative. It can think beyond the constraints of immediate experience, do strange things with words, conjure up futures and histories of all kinds, bring to life people who never existed, and invent for them plausible stories and environments. Despite the tangible evidence that this is so, the word cognition, in quotes, has traditionally been used to refer to the rational knowledge-seeking processes of the mind, as opposed to other modes of engagement with the world. And throughout, Terence actually makes certain shifts, preconceptions about the way, for example, he takes up the issue of memory, reason, and imagination, which have been compartmentalized almost in different parts of the brain for a very, very long period of human history. And he shows that this is not the case, that they are interwoven. And as we know from cognitive studies, memory is no longer necessarily infallible as memory, but all wrapped up with imagination. And the only person I've come across who intuited this is Leonardo, whose model of the brain actually has memory and imagination wrapped around each other rather than in separate boxes. Secondly, the book is a toolkit for reading and grasping the meanings and associations, the inferences of literature. And his own readings, as everyone has said, are truly exemplary. But the instruments are unfamiliar that he uses. So I'll just pick up, they've been mentioned by the people before me, but I'll just pick them up from the point of view of a literary reader. This kinesic understanding, this idea that the sensory motor perception system is activated by writing, especially by writing that has an effect on you, and in fact it's necessary. The embodiment of the inferences is necessary to the actual effect of writing. And you won't remember it, it won't go in, it won't absorb you unless that motor sensory apparatus is in some way triggered. And this has a relationship, Ilona mentioned the idea of sympathetic sensation, and it's certainly something I identify with very much in terms of reading. And it actually could be, I think, explored through an Indian system of aesthetics, which was developed for sacred dance, which some of you may have come across, called the rasa. And the rasa is actually a system whereby something that is expressed in one way will detonate a juice. Rasa means juice. You probably come across it in restaurants. Juice or savor. It will detonate that particular juice or savor in the human responsive apparatus. And that's different from what is represented on stage. So an act of violence on stage represented in dance will trigger a feeling of pity, for example, possibly. So the emotions that are in a kind of dialogue with each other. And it reminded me, Dan is a poet that Terence mentions, and it reminded me of this idea of some wonderful lines. We understood her by her sight. Her pure and eloquent blood spoke in her cheeks, and so distinctly wrought that one might almost say her body thought. Now, affordance is another key concept in kinesic. We've heard quite a bit about that. I think the key moment for me in the discussion, very rich discussion of affordance, is that language itself is an affordance. That language is a product of evolution that has actually given us a kind of instrument, almost a prosthesis, a way of engaging with experience and making it something we can afford, that gives us a way of using it, of going further than our own experience through language. And this is absolutely key to something I'll try and get to later. The relevance theory, again in literary terms, seems to me to enrich the concept of metaphor in very fundamental ways. Terence, again, as in the same way as he dissolves the opposition between reason and imagination in conventional thought, here dissolves ideas that figures of speech can be distinguished from one another very clearly. So he metaphor, simile, praeteritio, catachresis, all these things, he actually shows that there's much, much more fluidity, much more dynamics that are going on all the time in the way these things are deployed. And I think an example would be an analogy might be, I don't know if Terence would agree with this, is a chord in a musical phrase. So you're not getting, like something is like something. What you're getting is a whole series of chains of reverberations that are going through the chord in the musical phrase. So it's not, it wouldn't be a single shot in a film. And the characteristics of this fluidity and dynamism are under specification, that we are able to read or listen and actually bring to what we hear. And that under specification is a very important part of this language affordance. He has a wonderful quotation on the back of the book, and in fact the image, the jacket cover, is an interpretation of this wonderful quotation, which is as if from fireflies we could infer the field. And it's from a poem by Rebecca Elson, who unfortunately died young, is that right? Mm-hmm. And from Notes on Dark Matter, Notes Towards Dark Matter. She was dark matter. Yes, explaining dark matter. She was a scientist, yes, astrophysicist. And but I think you'll agree that this is, while a wonderfully rich line, extremely underspecified. I mean, there's no expansion of the idea of the fireflies, but yet we get it. If you've seen fireflies, and that's another important aspect of one of the ways that Terence comes at some of the conventions. He says that it is actually, there is the 18th century division between the imagined world and the real world is too tight, and that we need to have memories that we can activate, perceptual memories that we can activate in order for the under-specification not to matter. Then the truly crucial part of speech is the as if. And Deirdre and Ilona both talked about this idea of generating worlds that are story worlds, even though they need to be communicated to our perceptual systems, which might depend on our memories. Literature models and projects and imagines as-if worlds, which are different from the as-is worlds. So they're different from mimesis. This is a kind of an added dimension. And it's related to ideas of play. And I think to the Winnicottian idea that playing is reality. But he has a very interesting, wonderful phrase, which is epistemic vigilance. And this is the last key phrase I'm going to... Sorry?
It's not mine.
Oh, sorry. Well, in the book, sorry. Yeah. Okay, well, anyway. So this epistemic vigilance, which is a philosophical phrase, is underlines how important it is that while playing, that categories are kept in mind, so that let's pretend is not the same as is, as if is not as is. And of course we are all living now in digital communications that are making this kind of thing much, much more ambiguous and troubling. And then finally, I think the book shows that while we think with literature, we are also being thought by literature. That thinking about literature in this way it's showing us how we think, but also showing how our thinking is kind of fashioned. And I think that has really deep implications, actually, for where literature goes. I mean, what the impact is. And so my final example is, I gave you a handout, which is because I've long been interested in anonymous and sort of non-prestigious literatures. That is, often undated, no authors, which exist in almost everywhere in the world. Fairy tales, to some extent myths, but nursery rhymes. I've given you 2 nursery rhymes, one in English, one in French, because I wanted to pick up, and it's interesting that Deirdre actually mentioned this in particular, on Terence's discussion of the non-semantic, non-discursive values of a work, of a poem, that can't be redacted or summed up or précised. And these necessary qualities of a literary act, whether oral or written, the tonality, the music, the refrain, the repetition, the rhyme, the pattern, the overall shape, are interwoven with processes of memory, of what has been experienced, so it can engage. But in the case of the nursery rhyme or the small child listening, it is actually generating the world. So while lullabies and nursery rhymes in most cultures are connected to the language acquisition and correct pronunciation in the first place, with very neuroscientific and practical effect, the thinking with literature shows how the thoughtful pleasures of literature are involved with the play in these kinds of created works. And that it isn't just the recognition or anagnosis, as he wrote about before, of something already known, but the anticipatory recognition before the event, the shaping of future knowledge and experience. And this seems to me to be deeply connected with epistemic vigilance. So there was a man of double deed. I just revived it for you because it's a very remarkable example, I think, and a mysterious one, which I'm certainly not going to expound. But I think the clue from the first line is there was a man of double deed. It gives you advance notice that something is up here. And it's a model nonsense poem. It's mysterious and enthralling. The causal chain is disrupted through accumulation and invention until finally you reach what is a absolutely key kinesic punchline. It was like a penknife in my heart. And then my heart began to bleed. It was death and death, death indeed. So that seems to me to be a model of play, of logic, of showing how words create worlds, but then you must actually have this epistemic vigilance and see where it isn't true, where it's pretend, and then delivering you back into the strong sensory experience of blood and death. And the other one is very, very different, but gives a good example of how this kind of nonsense literature can be, valuable. Il était une bergère. I had actually forgotten what the story is, which pretty shocking story. And I think there you see that play and playfulness have a way of actually delivering ethical and moral situations. So the fact that it contains the murder of a kitten, and the sexual harassment of the girl by the priest, all in this playful, dancing meter, gives us a sense of how this kind of very, if you like, banal, popular literature keeps a tab on the world, keeps us vigilant. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deirdre, Ilona and Marina, for those rich and varied responses. I'm sure they've given Terence lots of things to respond to. Would you like to?
It's customary to thank everybody on these occasions, and thank you everybody for being here. Particularly want to thank Emily for chairing the session, and Torch with Elika and the whole Torch setup have supported this event, and Hannah Penny for organising it. I want to thank OUP for producing this, as it seems to me, a very beautiful book. I mean, the beauty is theirs, not I didn't do it, and giving me support throughout. I want to thank, as I have to on these occasions, rightly, the Balzan Foundation, which gave the money, without which there would have been no project, and without the project there would have been no thinking on these things. It's like one of those children's nursery rhymes, the swallow, the fly, and the whatever. And St John's College for very handsomely and generously supporting the project and me over very many years. As for the rest of the acknowledgements, you'll have to read the rather long acknowledgements in the book itself. Actually, if you want to skip the rest of it and just read the acknowledgements, you find it quite a good read, and so I recommend that. My job today is to respond to the commentators, and so I specifically want to offer my warmest thanks to them for coming here, being here today, and thank them for their very acute and interesting remarks, which were also very kind and generous. I can't reply to them properly, but we'll see what we can do. I think I do need to say something in general about why I wrote this book, and how it became a slightly different one from the one I originally imagined. My aim in the project and in this book was to promote the role of literary studies in what I call the cognitive conversation, which is the name of the second chapter. That's to say, the conversation that is palpably going on now, and has been going on for quite some time, between a whole range of subjects across the interdisciplinary spectrum, from neuroscience via various kinds of psychology, developmental, experimental, and so on, philosophy, different kinds of philosophy, phenomenological, analytic philosophy, and others, to the language, sciences, relevance theory, and other kinds of linguistics. And literary studies is beginning to join that conversation, but somehow that hasn't affected the mainstream of literary studies. There are just some people out there doing literary studies in a cognitive context. Now, I do think this is the most exciting and promising area of interdisciplinary research across the two cultures, if you like to use that old phrase, that is available at the moment. And I do think there's an opportunity that literary studies ought to try and grasp. And I thought at first it would be relatively easy to set out a stall and people say, yeah, this is a good thing, we should do something like this. But I did discover that people were suspicious of people in literary studies were suspicious of an approach which was apparently driven by what is often called, in a caricatural phrase, hard science. The word hard means several things there, I think. And by what they perceive as a relentless reductiveness and universalism, essentializing things like the human mind or brain or whatever. And a worry about rationalistic agendas more generally. But there's also the classic problem of persuading people to at least consider the possibility of shifting from one thought world to another, a thought world in which they've already made a big investment, moving out of that, doing quite a lot of reading in order to investigate another one, and that's very difficult to do when you're in mid-career, or indeed in your early career too. So it's very easy to do when you're a retiree, as one is now so horribly called, and has nothing to lose. So this book was written, it mutated into being a first attempt at getting people to see the point, to see it imaginatively as much as logically or technically. And perhaps one could say that it was written on the hypothesis that human cognition is primarily imaginative rather than rational. I think, in fact, that I've always worked, in some sense, on that principle, but in this case, it's become the whole raison d'être of the enterprise. It's become explicit, and I hope to spend the next few years working on it, if things work out favorably one way and another. So, I have only 2 or 3 minutes, really, to respond to these wonderful comments. let me begin perhaps with the question of the pirate raid. And by the way, I discovered recently that Alan Richardson, I think it was, used that same metaphor to talk about the way literary studies grabs bits of science and brings it home to do its own thing with. And and I do claim that I thought of that independently, but you know, these things converge. It's quite interesting that this is the view that can easily be taken. I think, Ilona, you said nice things about this. Why shouldn't one do it? And you have to accept, if you're working in your own discipline, however interdisciplinary your work is, that your work will be inflected by what you bring, but you will inflect those ideas as you bring them. However you treat it, you can't plonk down a whole piece of somebody else's discipline in the middle of your own. And that it wouldn't be a good thing if you did, because the important thing is to try to reshape the thought world that one's in and to help other people do the same reciprocally. So I was glad that you defended the pirate raid, and I think it helps perhaps to explain why what I thought of as a very productive discussion and debate with what it was that relevance theory was trying to do can seem in some sense as not a betrayal of relevance theory, because I'm very positive about relevance theory in this book and the way that it has abolished the code model, which has led to all kinds of problems in literary study, and put in what is broadly the inferential model. I'm very happy about that. There are problems about inference, because some people think that the only kind of inference, which is a legitimate inference, is a very reflective, conscious one. And some people have argued that very strongly, and that all the other things that look like inference, which are not reflective, are just pure instinct, or you just respond to something by some magic trick. I actually think that the word inference can be used across the spectrum, but you have to be careful about the scope you give it and what kinds of context, in what kind of context it operates. So actually, I think Deirdre and I do agree on nearly everything, but we come from different thought worlds, actually. I agree. And the pirate raids have an effect.
Just that last little bit.
Yes, it's that last little bit. It's always the last little bit, but both ways round. But that's a good thing. Yeah. And so Ilona, you talked about what is the scope of inference, and I tried to address it very briefly there. You talked about the broadening of the term affordances. Gibson does extend it in a very short paragraph at one point to include all sorts of stuff in human culture, including language, I think. So I don't think I broadened it so much more than he would have been prepared to do. But of course, what I've done is to leap on that bit, that bit of the pirate treasure, and expand it in the direction that was productive for the kind of work I do. Verifiability and our kinetic effects instantiated in brain activity. As far as I understand it, yes, they are instantiated. There is sufficient evidence to go with this idea and to think that when people hear or read about a particular kind of physical response, perhaps less than when they see it, but even so, it can be quite a strong effect. Their neural system begins to gear up for either a similar kind of action or a reciprocal action. So the business about pity and that violence triggers pity is not because you might first, as it were, respond to the violence and feel that in your system, but then that would instantly shift to the other side of the coin, which is how you would then feel it as a victim, presumably. So I think that broadly, as I understand it, kinetic effects are instantiated in brain activity, but clearly that they operate differently for different kinds of readers, and it depends what you're attending to when you read. If you go in with a very strong kind of conceptual preference when you read a poem or a novel, and are looking for certain themes, or ideas. I mean, if you read Andrew Marvell's The Garden, looking for abstract thought, you will certainly find it, even in the phrase a green thought in a green shade. If you're a bit more kinesic, as it were, or you allow those effects, you don't filter them out, then the greenness will become very salient, and the way that the poet in that poem engages with the garden environment. Okay, I think it is after 1:45 now. There are lots and lots of things here. I would like to say something about the children's rhymes, but I think I'm going to stop and just thank you once again and let people ask questions or have their say or whatever. But I hope you'll ask questions of the other people too.